Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym wykładzie w ramach programu Biuro Możliwości, który jest rozwijany od zeszłego roku w CSW i poświęcony jest badaniu instytucji sztuki, instytucji kultury w współczesnej rzeczywistości artystycznej. Dzisiejszym gościem zamku i projektu Biuro Możliwości jest Alfredo Cramerotti, artysta, pisarz, badacz i przede wszystkim kurator. Alfredo jest w Warszawie przez kilka dni, jest na wizytach studyjnych i towarzyszą mu kuratorki programu Artist in Residence Laboratory. Ta współpraca i wizyta Alfredo jest możliwa dzięki pomocy miasta Warszawa. Cóż, nasz gość jest człowiekiem orkiestrą, zajmującym się bardzo wieloma rzeczami. Jak lubi mówić o sobie, głównie rzeczywistością we wszystkich jej obrazach i przejawach, dlatego też bardzo wiele czasu i energii poświęca współczesnym mediom, takim jak radio, telewizja, internet. Jest dyrektorem Mountain Gallery w północnej Walii. Był jednym z kuratorów manifesta Biennale, 8 manifesta Biennale w Mursji w Kartagenie. I cóż, nie pozostaje mi nic innego, jak zaprosić Państwa na wykład i oczywiście do zadawania pytań naszemu gościowi po wykładzie. Będę chętnie służyć mikrofonem.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for being here, and thank you for the invitation. I would like actually to start with some music, just to kick off, really. There we go.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nub. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner because the revolution will not be televised, brother. There will be no pictures of you and Willie Mae pushing that shopping cart down the block on the dead run or trying to slide that color TV into a stolen ambulance. NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:32 on report from 29 districts. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
And there we go. It will be live. I started with this video not only because it's a great video and a great piece of music, and Jill Scott Heron's actually, it was an important figure. I started because it represents somehow, is a metaphor of precisely what I mean by starting from the middle somehow. You probably got the idea, reading maybe the introduction to this talk, that I'm kind of a hybrid beast, so I work with different things, which is actually quite a common situation nowadays, especially if you work in the cultural field. Myself, I'm an artist, and I'm an editor, which is quite a similar job, really, of the curator, which I do since more than a decade so far. I'm a member of two collectives, one an curatorial collective, one an artistic collective, doing kind of all sort of a small, medium project, kind of a very low budget things. And I'm also running an institution, which is some sort of a national institution in Wales. And sometimes, you know, they ask me, how can I manage to do this kind of two very different things, actually, as running kind of a low-budget collective artist-run exhibition and or exhibition program, let's say, or editing books and running an institution. And I think it's part of the same thing, really. It's all of these kind of activities are somehow like bricks in a wall, which is the wall of an architecture of life, in a way. Also because I work as an artist, somehow, I went many times kind of back with my mind and say, okay, how can I sort of take something on board and do a project which is some sort of or do a work which is somehow meaningful, and how can I assume somehow the responsibility for doing it, through my sort of activities, or different activities, to say it in a better way, I slowly construct this idea that it's quite an interesting point to start from the middle of the things. So what I brought you tonight is basically some loose thoughts, really, not so loose in a way, but it's something that is not a lecture that I did before, because actually I wrote the lecture on scrap paper in the last 3 days, since Sunday, so it's something that I did it when I was here, putting together different things, really, and I wrote it on paper, on scrap paper and on pencils. I could have used the computer, but somehow it felt that I had the need somehow to get it out on paper with my hands. It's kind of a weird thing. Anyway, I wrote this some thoughts, and I would like to present it to you tonight. I basically, it's about 10 pages. I will take about half an hour, and then I would like to open up to the floor for Q&A, question, answer, comments, feedback, doubts, attacks, anything really. And let's see what comes up, actually. It's, I realize actually that it's probably something that I write with having the work of an artist in my soul. Is probably something focused on artists. But let's see, anyway. I often argue that making and participating in art is a prominent way to unpack the world we live in, but it's not the only way to discuss the urgent problems of society, nor art exhibitions are the only context in which these urgencies, so to speak, can be addressed. But certainly art does not leave them outside its sphere, and for a good reason. Over time, human beings develop the ability for art to relate to the space and time in which they live. So, if we go back to cave paintings, for instance, from those cave paintings to current social, political research in art and data flow analysis of artist activists, all this emerges to relate in a meaningful way us human beings with our natural and artificial environment. So with what we found there before us and what we created, basically. Art and its processes constantly question the meaning of here and now. And that relates to the video that you just saw there, actually. The revolution will be live. So it's not something that you leave throughout some other element. It's something that if you do, it touches you personally. And art connects to other times and places, this here and now. Even in a post-atomic scenario, the survivors would resume after a while activities that have little to do with survival equipment and much more to do with philosophical and intellectual stimulation or speculation, if you want. We can't help it. It's what differs us from other animals. I usually don't like to quote, but I have a couple of quotes anyway, or at least kind of ideas. And one of them it was Marshall McLuhan, that beside many other things, in his work, identify in the arts a sort of an early alarm system. And he's called it actually as such, early alarm system. Somehow a mechanism to train our perception to a new level in order to be ready for the changes that may occur or may not occur. And I like it very much, this idea of art as a sort of early alarm system. And actually I thought that in time, probably, I tried at least always to work on something that it was somehow making some bells ringing in my head. And I'm sure it happens to each of us. You know, you have something that ringing the bells, and then you say, well, what is it? And then you try to work on it, or to address it at least, or to face it. So art, or what we call art at least, I think happens where knowledge about something enters in conflict with imagination, and that's a conflict that is not only welcome, but also important, is productive, and is also healthy for the world in a way. I guess this program of talks to which I'm invited, so talks, lectures, conferences, symposia, is called Office of Possibilities, because in a way the work of an artist is a center of possibilities, is a center of possible studies, maybe. So a number, kind of a range of studies that are not strictly defined, but they are imaginable. And because they are imaginable, they become possible, precisely because we can imagine them. Things are possible when we can imagine. And, you know, it might be impossible, but then at a certain time it becomes possible because we can conceive them. And that's the second quote as well. Albert Einstein. Einstein, a scientist, not an artist, although some can consider him an artist as well, reportedly stated that we cannot solve our problems at the same level of thinking that generated those problems. For instance, if we take into consideration, just to give an example, the relation between art and journalism, which is something that I'm very familiar with because I wrote a book called Aesthetic Journalism. If you take into consideration this relationship, it happens that if we open up and rethink our conception of traditional information formats, so the formats in which we gather information, and we open up these formats and we allow ourselves to take in consideration imagination and open-endedness to come into the picture of information, we might perceive things in a ways that we were unaware of. In this sense, always taking in consideration this example, while journalism reports and fiction reveals, a combined approach that we might call aesthetic journalism, but you can call it in another way if you want. In the 60s in Spain, they were calling the raison poética, so the poetic reason. So this approach can do both, can actually both report and reveal. This combined approach, let's say this attitude, might achieve a kind of knowledge looking beyond what is immediately visible. It can achieve a sort of a latency, if I can use this English term, an imaginative reading of what is not directly accessible to our senses, to our eyes, to our ears, to our body. And cultural producers, artists, but also other people as well, media producers, for instance, can use elements like the passage of time, but by applying an attentive eye to current and manifest aspect of the matter taken into consideration, but also to what is concealed to our senses, to what is concealed to the eye, for instance, and can take in consideration its possible or imaginary development. In a way, this is starting from the middle and go in every direction or in some direction. You can go back, you can go forward, you can go in space, or you can go in time. And it takes time to decide for an audience point of view how to and if to relate to all aspects of a situation and the people and stories of that situation that we gather knowledge about. It takes time to assess, for instance, what could be true or false, right or wrong, useful or useless. And ultimately, it takes time to decide where one, as a viewer or as a spectator, if you want, stands in relation to both ethics and aesthetics. It is somehow a matter of adding pieces of knowledge, linking what we already know or what we assume we know with what we do not know or we assume we do not know, and putting the new in sequence with the other knowledge, in sequence with the past, but also in sequence with the imaginable, with the future. That's why an artist, I think, and this, I speak for myself as an artist in this case, that's why an artist has the right to start from an X point, and that might be not at the beginning of the process. It might be further down the line. It might be back in time, or it might be forward into the future. And he or she can go in every direction and not assume that it has to start from the beginning. And it's quite interesting because it's usually we say this thing, oh, let me start from the beginning, and you start to tell something. And I'm not quite sure actually if it's really, really worth to start from the beginning, or maybe it's worth to jump into things and position ourselves and see in which direction to go. That's also why a viewer or a spectator or a user or a consumer or a prosumer, whatever you want to call it, has also the right to come and go in front of a work or a presentation or a classification if it is an archive, or a clarification or a problematization of a matter at one's leisure, and he has the right to be irreverent to the format of the reproduction of things, being that an artwork or a journalistic report or a poem. He has the right to take time to make sense of what is presented. And these are all opportunities that must be kept alive for an audience. Because eventually all this will expand back into the artist's work, into the scientist's investigation, into the journalist's report, into the politician brief or speech. But it's us as an audience that needs to take these rights and feed it back. Ultimately, it's not that the simultaneously or the simultaneity or the accomplishment or the revealing that is important when we talk about something. It's more important, I think, the development of an essence, of a core of our existence that works also at the level of imagination, and I would add here also at the level of desire as well. What I think counts in all this is to keep up this position of possibilities and keep up the possibilities of perennial rework and research and rereading of things. It requires us as producers but also as consumers to suspend our notion of the experience, of what we experienced, and suspend it as something which is not fixed and immutable. And if we suspend it, it doesn't mean to create fiction. It means to change the mode of reading the world out there. And this is, I think, if we take into consideration the artist's work, and most of you are artists, I suppose, this goes hand in hand with the dissolution of art as a distinct, autonomous and coded practice. By coded, I mean with specific media and tools. And it goes hand in hand also with a certain idea of interactivity or the possibility of interaction, let's say. Now, I know this is a kind of a tricky point if you are an artist to declare that you should forget the autonomy of art. And also is a tricky point as a curator, I would say. But I think it's good to discuss this one. I'll go on a bit and then we can pick it up later at the Q&A. Whatever we might experience as facts, for instance, in a way are also artworks because they are processes. So there is a process in between. Facts doesn't emerge as such. There is a process between, and somehow there's a parallel element with an artwork that came into being. They don't happen in a vacuum. And if you think what we are, it's attributed by other people. And what we see instead is attributed by ourselves. We somehow ought to invest our ability to receive things, to receive stories, situations, claims, as the main tool to build our truth at best claims. So, to make sense of what surrounds us, I just said, we ought to invest in our ability to receive, not in the material we receive. That's a crucial difference. It's a very different thing. It means in other words, to instigate a process of what I would call sustained curiosity. Curiosity, sustaining means actually invest in curiosity, basically, and attempt to comprehend what we are curious about and therefore unaware of. Probably if we are curious about something, it's because we are ignorant of or possibly we are ignorant of. So, and it's good to keep it open. It's good to be curious and sustaining this curiosity as an attempt to comprehend what we don't know, what we are unaware of. Someone would say it's not good to try to comprehend, but it's good to try to not comprehend in a meaningful way. And this one is Jalal Tawfiq, but I think we are going into the philosophical here, and I don't want to. I'd better stay this way. It becomes too involuted and complicated otherwise, and it brings into the picture a lot of other things. So, as far as for the title of this talk, I believe in starting from the middle. I also believe that what artists do is not about creating new artistic knowledge, or well, new knowledge, but rather shifting existing modes of knowledge, shifting along. And this implies entering a mutual relationship with other systems of society, be that medicine, law, journalism, architecture, you name it. So enter a sort of reciprocal dependency with other areas of life that can be relevant when addressing a specific topic, when working on something. So basically, it's as if the artist's work is about shifting perspective, really. And it takes on board what I said before, about the autonomy of art. You cannot really shift in perspective if you keep the autonomy, I think. Any significant cultural work could not simply propose a narrative that is linear. Linear, I mean, proposing some sort of a narrative which is, in the end, ends up in a dichotomy, in a division. Either you accept it or refuse it, of a certain story or of a certain information, or of a certain worldview. Maybe it would be more important if the same work facilitated the beholder to ask relevant question by her or himself. So not having the artist put in the question, but kind of generating the question at the level of the reception, almost coaching the viewers in this sense, not proposing an invitation to go along or to refuse it, but somehow using the artwork and the artistic context and the artistic institution as well, like this one, almost as a training session in self-awareness. And cultural work or cultural production is increasingly at the forefront of how we understand the world we live in. And that's why I think it's important to understand the possibility of the artist's work and the possible modalities of this work. And when I say that it's increasingly at the forefront of how we understand the world, if you think about back, let's say, a few decades, 50 or 60 years ago, even the 60s, not to go far away, but at that time there was the economic mechanism were actually the main referent for our experience as a member of a society. Either in terms of conforming to those elements, economic or refusing it. Just think about the hippie generation, for instance. Somehow it was based on either the refusal or the acceptance of those kind of economical mechanism. And probably now is no longer the case, or at least is no longer the only one. There are other elements coming into the picture. Economic achievement and well-being are probably no longer sufficient for appropriate comprehension or not comprehension in a meaningful way of phenomena such as the abused term of clash of civilization, for instance. You can spot it, there is a culture, an economic element in it, but it's not actually the main one, I think. So maybe we are in a phase in which we need to readdress what are our main reference, and maybe we need to readdress our reference in a cultural terms, and even, I would say, in aesthetic terms. It is telling, for instance, that a lot of multinationals and businesses reinvest their profits in cultural and artistic projects, from big clothing company to banks to whatever you can think of, in order somehow to create a culture that can travel beyond national schemes and beyond monetary values as such. It is a way of fidelization of the customer, of course, with enormous potential, but it's interesting that they're using cultural tools and cultural means and vehicles, basically, and artistic and specifically. Conversely, artists, but also curators and producers and mediators or educators as well, feel that they cannot live outside their work the fact of researching in or committing to the social and the political, and therefore engage with structure of production, discussion, mediation, distribution outside the specific constraints of art. And it's not because they're better equipped to do such a thing, but it's because they cannot live outside their work. These kind of urgencies have become so urgent that if you are kind of ambitious in a good sense, you cannot leave these things outside your work. So we have the hybridization of practice on one side, and this non-linearity, as I was mentioning before, on the other side. And non-linearity, it's a bit like kind of discussing the difference between philosophy and critical theory. If you are more familiar or more inclined to discuss things in this term, you know, one considers the origins and the provenience of things and of thoughts, and builds on previous ideas and somehow embraces somehow the idea of progression or regression. There are some philosophy that it goes back to the past and say, well, that's, you know, it was better as it was before. And critical theory instead, it doesn't have a linear lineage, but combines different fields, often laterally or obliquely as well. And if you are, or for instance, if you are into textiles, it's the same as the difference between knitting and crochet. Knitting is linear, and crochet goes by expansion. I got this from my wife. She's a textile designer. She gave me a good idea, actually. So, as an artist, one embraces the challenge to engage with communities. However, we can define these communities. It can be physical communities, like, you know, the art community, or the local community, for instance, if you are in a specific context, city, something like this, or incorporeal community. It could be an internet audience, it could be a time audience, for instance. Just think of a book, for instance, a book kind of put together audiences in time rather than space. So an artist embraces these challenges and he delivers them in kind of in the present, but also in the past and the future, using a variety of media, spaces, and methods. And this perspective of the artist, but also of the curator, of the producer, are constantly tested, are constantly also subverted and even used against them by the audience. And I think it's an important thing, this one. It's important to have it clear that for the possibility to read things in a meaningful way, we don't have to assume we transfer knowledge to an a knowledge part of society. And because somehow there is no gap between the producer and the audience. There is, each of them, they know something the other doesn't know, and it's not something which is new actually, because this one, it was basically the base of the open work of Umberto Eco in the 60s, for instance. It was the base of Rancière, the ignorant schoolmaster, in the 90s. So it comes, it pops up actually every 30, 40 years, this thing. But it's actually, I think, which is true. It's important to be aware that this gap is not something that we need to assess and fix. It's a condition which is normal. And what probably the artist's work does is actually to get each other perspective. And, but in order to get this perspective, we need to generate point of access to enter and to discuss and to participate in the discussion related to the subject we are talking about. I'm aware that this is a kind of a theoretical approach and a theoretical talk I'm doing tonight. But I think it's something which is important because, you know, we are in an art institution, and probably most of you are artists or curators, and we are all doing the same work in a way, theoretically. And I think sometimes it's important to kind of reflect on what we are doing and trying to figure it out if there are other things that we can do. That's why I choose not to show whatever I've done in the last 20 years or so, but it's something that I kind of project on the future somehow, how I might do things tomorrow in 10 years' time. And I still like to do it because I think art is an interesting tool, and if used as a sort of as a key to unlock these potential points to enter and to get access to each other's knowledge. And you know, it might be through passion, through necessity, through desire, as I was mentioning before. But I think that being aware about this thing is somehow the essence of participation in society. And I participate only when I allow myself and engage with this possibility of something I was mentioning before, to keep it open, this possibility and this office of possibilities as we are here tonight. And both, I think, artistic and curatorial agency not only have to raise questions, which is what we usually say about art. We usually say that art is about asking questions, which is true in a way. I do also think that probably it's good if art provides some answers at some point, however limited, however temporal, however kind of precarious they might be. And it's also important, I think, and crucial, that art should inhabit the problem by hybridizing with something else and being skilled in problem definition. So I was talking about the sustained curiosity before, and I think sustained curiosity is a good way to refine our ability to problem definition, not problem solving, but problem definition, which is, you know, what is before problem solving. And so in somehow decentralizing a field of inquiry, basically I was talking about shifting perspectives. Shifting perspectives basically shift ideas across multiple borders. So to take an inquiry or a range of inquiries, a field of inquiries, and try to decentralize it, shifting ideas across multiple borders, physical, metaphorical, and allow us to basically to start from the middle, to have a point zero coordinates which is movable and can change at any time. So being focused on the topic that we want to talk about it, but keeping a movable point of view. And since it's a bit tricky, this thing, and probably I'm not completely clear in it, also because I wrote it actually yesterday, so I didn't really have a lot of time to refine it, but I'll give an example, a concrete example. And I don't know if you remember, but the founder of Wikipedia, Julian Assange, last year, I think, published a long interview on eFlux journal. And there was a lot of blah blah, really. But in all this kind of a long interview, he said something that I thought it was quite interesting. And it was in the middle of the text, really. It wasn't really a key point, but I thought it was interesting. He said basically that censorship, the act of censoring information, is an economical act. And because to suppress information requires a huge amount of resources, financial and human resources, in effect, this act of censorship emits an economical signal that anywhere it happens, the potential impact of the data involved is real and can be tangibly affect political structure. So, and I thought it was quite an interesting thing. What he was saying, basically, is that shifting the perspective from a political sphere, a political point about censorship, to a matter of economical measurement, it is a way to understand how and when a structure is primed to change. And it seems to me a very effective way of reasoning, of working. I thought it was interesting. I don't know if it's really true, really, but he was mentioning this one as an example of the whole kind of a research of Wikipedia and kind of whistleblower and blah 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 work has been made manifest throughout the last 10 years. So they spotted this pattern basically. And it's almost like censorship is actually an opportunity rather than a limitation. So I'm not saying it's a good thing, but there is something here that is actually quite good, and it has to do with the idea of shifting perspectives. So and decentralize a point of view. And in a way, it reminds me as well of an idea of making holes in the fabrics of society. And it's something that my colleague Rian Lozano in Manifesta 8 actually told me once. I said, well, I think art is important. She said something like, I think art is important when it creates these holes in the legal and historical fabrics. And I liked the idea of making holes. To basically pass from one system to the other. So expanding through art the possibility to understand other systems, basically. And using literally art as an agent, as an office for possibilities. And that goes back, when we say to better understand other systems, that goes back to the idea of compromising its autonomy. So art it's not that art replaces the rest of activities and disciplines, such as, you name it, sociology, geography, politics, journalism, etc., just to name a few, because we draw on these disciplines on a daily basis to give meaning, to give order, to give priority to the world out there. Because we are immersed in such a huge flux of information that we need to have some discipline, some structures in order to digest it and to make sense. So it's not that art is better or it replaces this thing, and nor is an alternative and another authoritarian narration capable to subsume those other fields. However, it can expand the function of these other disciplines, and I think is a crucial point. So when it expands actually the possibility to understand and the possibility to act, therefore, and help us to make sense of them better, and help to test, hypothesize, and setting in motion certain assumptions, certain belief that we had already assumed through other disciplines, and most of them actually comes from our education, our family, our job as well. So it's something that maybe we're not aware about it, but it's something that is there. So I would argue at this point that art's most powerful moment happens when it points beyond its own structure and beyond its own relationship to realize possibilities around and within us. And this possibility to start from a movable point zero and to keep somehow the social discourse, the representation, the historization of a certain matter in a state of suspension, it's what art produces. And there is another consequence if we take on board this one. It means that we are all somehow implicated as audiences, not only as artists, not only as producers, but also as audiences. And it makes possible not to position ourselves totally external to those fields, but it makes us part of it, because we are part of it. It makes us aware about it. So because we are all implicated, I think art too should probably cease to regard itself as autonomous and enter what I called before as this sort of a state of mutual dependency, reciprocal dependency with other sectors of society and life. So enter it, declare it, and be clear about it. And probably compromises as well. And there is something that is probably inevitable if you enter this other system. And of course, as artists, you will still be very uncomfortable with that. And as a curator, I would be very uncomfortable with that and kind of a bit suspicious. But I think this idea of using the compromise as a productive tool, it's quite refreshing somehow, because it frees us from the idea that we have to start from the beginning. And I think in order to grasp or to understand, let's say, and also finally to act, we must intervene into this matter, into the subject of the thing, being this subject an image, being a story, and claim space for ourselves in that world as artists and also as audience. We need to partake in this labor of storytelling, if you want to call it storytelling, or imaging. Otherwise, all these works remain mute, so to speak. So become part of the content and the medium, become one and the other. And this is, I think, a journey that expands we started from the office of possibility. I think this is a journey that expands the possibility of the office, the possibilities of the office. A journey that tries to challenge those limits, like the assumption that we have to start from the origin somehow, related to the production and the diffusion of knowledge in space and in time. And I finish here, so I would like to open up to the questions or comments. Thank you.